So, welcome everybody to this Think Forward Educators event. We are so excited to have Nathaniel Hansford presenting for us at the Maths Network. My name is Sasha Durietto. I am the leading teacher at Pleasant Street Primary School here in Ballarat in Victoria in Australia, the convener of the Maths Network. And we've also got Katie here from Think Forward. She's our CEO. And we're really excited to have everyone here tonight. We think that we've had hundreds and hundreds of registrations because we know that this is such a hot topic that educators are really invested in and want to be having these educated, evidence-based conversations around how we teach maths. And so we know it's going to be an excellent webinar. And it's amazing to see there's so many people from all over the world here tonight, and even more who will watch the recording, I'm sure. So I'm going to start off with sharing an acknowledgement of country from the children who are at my primary school here in Ballarat. So we acknowledge the Wathaurong people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the land. We thank you for sharing and caring for the land we learn and play on. We pay respects to elders past and present. And I have the pleasure of introducing Nathaniel Hansford here tonight. Nathaniel Hansford has taught every grade pre-K to 12 in places like South Korea, the United Kingdom, Ontario, and the subarctic of Quebec. In 2022, he won the Literacy Leader of the Year award from the Ontario International Dyslexia Association. Nathaniel has written numerous articles and books on the science of teaching. He is most interested in using meta-analysis research to help teachers implement proven methodologies. Nathaniel graduated from Lakehead University in Thunder Bay, Ontario, Canada, with a bachelor's degree in education and history. He also holds 11 additional teaching qualifications, including a specialty in reading and special education. So we are so pleased to have you here, Nate, tonight. I know you've got a lot to get through, and so I'll hand over to you to get started.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, guys. I'm going to be talking about the problem with balanced math today. And I'm being a little tongue-in-cheek here when I use the phrase balanced math, because it's not a term I've heard anyone use meaningfully, especially not to discuss what I'm going to be talking about today with the constructivist math approach. However, I think there is a growing consensus that there was a problem with how we teach literacy instruction in the Western world. And I think most people recognize this idea that there was a problem with specifically balanced literacy. But I think where people fail to realize is that balanced literacy is actually based on a larger philosophical movement called constructivist teaching. And that, I think, approach is actually far more popular in math instruction than it is in reading instruction. In fact, I think we're worse off in math instruction than we are in reading, generally speaking. Just as two quick notes, if you want to ask me a question as we go through, feel free to put it in the chat. I'll do my best to answer questions, as long as it doesn't get to be too many, and as long as they're like sort of on topic to the presentation. I did get a bunch of questions in advance, and a lot of people were really asking me about specific authors. I will say I'm not going to come on and slam any authors, but I will try to address the philosophies and points of those authors as we go through this presentation. I was going to talk a little bit about myself on the next slide, but I think Sasha's already talked way more about myself than I want to. And the only note I'll make is just that I'm not a professor, I'm not a researcher, I'm just a teacher, but I'm super interested in bringing evidence-based practices in the classroom, and always for the purpose of how do we build greater equity in our classrooms. And I think the best way to do that is to rely on strategies that have been proven in research. So we'll go ahead and just skip that slide about me. So first off, I'm going to talk about what is balanced math. And some of the ideas that I've heard talked about a lot as constructivist math, or as what people claim to be evidence-based, is that procedural instruction is just mimicry. And I think this is a big focus, that procedural instruction is bad and that conceptual knowledge is far more important and good. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the presentation. That students need productive struggle, which seems to mean that students need math problems that are really, really difficult, that they're going to struggle on, that they need open-ended situational problems, that minimal direct instruction is ideal, sort of flipping that traditional direct instruction model of I do, we do, you do, to you do, we do, I do. Never teaching formulas, direct instruction causes math anxiety, and observational assessments are ideal. Now, I'm going to throw this out there. The one thing I'm not going to address in this presentation really is that observational assessments versus more traditional math assessments. And I think that's just because there's not a lot of research on that, because typically how do we do research is through assessment. We use assessment to measure the results. And truthfully, I think the reason why there's resistance to to traditional assessments within this balanced math movement, as I'm tongue-in-cheek calling it, is because uh, it would prove that it doesn't work. Um, if we have to rely on assessment data, then we have to admit that something we're doing isn't working if we use this type of approach, because this approach doesn't really work. Um, and I'm gonna just give a little personal anecdote before I go any further too. And I'm the one about never teach formulas. I think that's the most damaging on this list. I'm not saying that all of math instruction needs to be about formulas, but I've actually been told in PD sessions before to never teach formulas, and not in my current school board, just in case anyone from my current school board's watching. But um, this idea, I think, is particularly harmful for our students who are weaker math students naturally. I know myself, like, people often think that I'm this really good at math person because I do a lot of stats, but actually math is the thing that's always been really difficult for me. And actually, I think it's made me a better teacher because it's made me realize what my students need to be successful. And I know that I'm not going around inventing new formulas on a regular basis. So this idea that our like grade 3 students with math disabilities or learning disabilities are going to be inventing their own formulas for problems, I think is a bit crazy. There's a reason why the person who invented Pythagorean theorem is famous. It's because inventing formulas is difficult. So expecting a grade 2 student or a grade 1 student or a grade 3 student to just come up with a formula on their own is a bit unrealistic. I just see a couple of things in the chat, so I'm just going to check to see if we have any questions. Okay. So, I think we're seeing the results of this approach throughout the world. So I've shared some assessment in general in Canada, where we've seen constructivist math really take off. We've actually seen math scores drop for 20 straight years. In fact, on the PISA test, we haven't had a single year in the last 20 years where scores went up. In Ontario, my home province, where constructivist math is also very popular, we see a similar trend. We had a little bit of a bump in 2010 when we implemented lowering assessment standards, in part through growing success. But in general, after we released a new focus on inquiry-based learning math in 2005, math scores have dropped ever since. You see the same thing in the United States and the United Kingdom, where their PISA scores have gone down since 2000, the year 2000, very consistently across the board. And actually, this is the Australian data too, where you see the exact same trend, especially in math, where math scores have been going down for roughly 20 years straight. I don't think this is a coincidence. I've had the opportunity to teach throughout many countries in the world, and I've had the opportunity to engage with people on social media throughout the world. And I have seen that constructivist math has just gone really high. Sorry, someone's asking if they can have authority over the slideshow. I don't think so. You've seen constructivist math has just risen in popularity throughout the world. And I think some of this is actually not so much driven by research. It's a philosophical move. I think it's based on the idea that we need to make classrooms more fun and democratic. And I don't know if that in itself is a bad idea. The problem is when we take these ideas to extremes, like saying never teach a math formula, which I've had PD presenters tell me you should never teach one. I'll never forget, I had one tell me, before you teach a formula, you got to get the kids a month to play with the numbers and play with the math. And then maybe at the end of the month, if they haven't got it yet, just give them the formula. I would argue that day one, you should probably give them the formula and not try and make it some mystery. I don't think we want learning to be a mystery. I think we want to teach students right from the get-go. Think about this in terms of reading instruction. Are we going to teach the students to read without teaching them phonics? Are we going to say, well, they're just going to figure out the phonics on their own. We're just going to let them play with the words. There's a little bit of magical thinking that goes on with this type of approach. So the philosophy that has inspired this all is called constructivist teaching. John Hattie defines constructivist teaching as involving providing students with learning-centered active instruction where students explore ideas, propositions, explanations, solutions, and take subsequent actions. The theory originates from Jean Piaget, who believed that learning happens through scaffolding of understanding. Today, this theory is especially prevalent in math. So when I say learning happens through scaffolding of understanding, it's to say that the learning is centered on the students and evolves from their understanding of math instruction over time, or in general, I should say, because constructivist theory is not limited to just math. So according to the University of Buffalo, the principles behind the constructivist teaching are as follows. We have to create cognitive dissonance, assigning problems and activities that will challenge students. Knowledge is built as learning encounters novel problems, and revise existing schemas as they work through challenging problems. You then apply that knowledge with feedback, encouraging students to evaluate new information and modify existing knowledge. Activities should allow for students to compare pre-existing schema to novel situations. Activities might include presentation, small group or class discussion, and quizzes. Reflect on learnings, provide students the opportunity to show you and themselves what they've learned, which might include presentations, reflective papers, or creating a step-by-step tutorial for another student. And lastly, eliciting prior knowledge. New knowledge is created in relation to pre-existing knowledge. Lessons therefore require eliciting relevant knowledge. Activities include pre-test, informal interviews, small group form activities, etc. Now, I provide this like textbook definition of how to teach because I want to make sure that I'm referencing people who believe in constructivist teaching when I go through this, so you have that comparison. But I also think it's important to acknowledge, what does this look like in practice? So I think you sort of see this lesson plan model in a lot of popular PD on math, sort of focusing on that situational problem. You give the students a really difficult problem that they're going to have really struggle to solve on their own, and then slowly give them feedback to help them come to the answer over lesson. I think there's a couple main problems with this. The first problem is that typically the students who do well in this model are only going to be the top of class. I know personally, this is not a model that I would have succeeded in. I think another problem is that you're getting through so little instruction in a period of time. If you're, say, spending 25 minutes on one math problem in a class, think how little teaching you've actually done during that period. Think how little practice you're giving. You know, when we think back to phonics for a second, and I keep bringing it back to reading because learning doesn't happen in a vacuum. Math instruction and reading instruction are not entirely separate. I've heard people claim there are, but there's no research that I'm aware of to support that. In fact, the part of the brain that's used to develop math knowledge, the part of the brain that's used to develop reading knowledge are very closely related. But when we look at reading instruction, we talk about this idea of automaticity. That students need to develop automaticity through large amounts of retrieval practice of doing a task over and over and over again. The same thing applies to math. If you teach students a formula, they're not going to learn it one time. If you teach them a concept, they're not going to learn it one time. So if we spend the entire lesson on one or two math problems, the amount of learning that's going to happen is going to be very limited. So I'm going to be going through some meta-analysis research in this presentation. This is my presentation, and that's usually what I focus on. And I want to give some people some basic background information. So first off, what is a meta-analysis? A meta-analysis is a study of studies where we try to find out what is the average effect or outcome of a research study on that topic. This is really important. How many of you have ever heard the anecdote of some people say eggs are good for you, some people say eggs are bad for you? Go ahead and put it in the chat. I don't know what to think. Doctors keep changing their mind about what research shows. I think this is just a byproduct of the fact that the way we evaluate research, it's media, popular media, is typically wrong. It often looks at this like a new study model. Well, a new study shows X, or a new study shows this. The problem with that is that, yes, certain studies might show conflicting results, but what we want to typically look for is, what do most studies on a topic show? And we typically measure this in meta-analysis with the use of what's called an effect size, which is the standardized percentage. It's a little bit of an oversimplification, but the easiest way I can explain this is to a little bit of measuring like what percentage of growth we saw in between two groups. So how much better did the treatment group, the group that received the pedagogy or the treatment, do than the group that did not? And if we see a negative effect size, that means that the group that received the specific type of instruction did worse. So this is considered the basic guidelines to interpreting effect sizes. So 0.2 is seen as low. Anything below that is seen as negligible. 0.5 is considered average. 0.8 is considered strong, and exceptional is considered 1.2 or above. One way of thinking this is an effect size of 1 would suggest that the treatment group did 100% better than the control group. Although generally speaking in education, we don't see results that are this high as 1.2. So personally, my rule of thumb is if I see an effect size of 0.40 or higher, I'm generally speaking optimistic, especially if the studies are rigorous. So there's only, to the best of my knowledge, a very small number of peer-reviewed studies on constructivist math instruction. So Earson 2015 did a meta-analysis on constructivist teaching. You'll notice that they did not look at language. The highest results were for art and science, but they did show very large effect sizes for math. However, only 2 of the studies in this meta-analysis were on math, and an effect size based on just 2 studies is just really not reliable. You really need more research than that to mean something. There was another meta-analysis done by Xi in 2018, and this showed really large results again too. However, it was based on Chinese students. And if you're not familiar with the model of instruction in China, it's very procedurally focused. There's many hours of instruction during the day, much more than you would see in a typical Western country. I've seen estimates as high as over 12 hours a day of studying. And actually, China typically has the highest math achievement results in the world. It's also important to note that this meta-analysis was done on grade 7 and 8 students. So if you look at grade 7 and 8 students in China who've had a really strong base level of instruction through direct instruction on math, yes, they do benefit from inquiry-based learning and constructivist approach. But I don't know how much that applies to, say, a grade 1 classroom in the United States. It's also really important to notice that if you look at the bottom, we have this improved transmission. This is where they combined both constructivist teaching and traditional direct instruction and provided more scaffolding and explicit instruction that would be normally shown in an inquiry-based learning classroom. And this one showed better than did a traditional constructivist approach. And that's going to be a theme that we see throughout this presentation when we look at research. Typically speaking, when we provide more explicit instruction and more support for students, they do better. I'd like to think of it this way. If I was to tell you to go fix your car tomorrow, your car is broken, and I say, here's some tools, go fix your car. Would you rather go look up on YouTube first how to do it, have me give you some instructions on how to fix your car? Or would you rather say, here are the tools, just go play with the engine, see what you find? I think most people would prefer the greater level of structured approach. I'm just going to look at the chat for a quick second. Okay. Some strong opinions on some topics, but no questions. So let's look at some of the principles of constructivist math, because unfortunately, there's not a lot of research just on constructivist math in general, but we can look at some of the types of instruction that are used in constructivist classrooms and examine what is the research body on those. So the first one I want to talk about is conceptual versus procedural knowledge. So procedural knowledge is a knowledge of algorithms, formulas, and math facts. Conceptual knowledge is knowledge of mathematical principles and how formulas can be applied. Personally, I think these can be divided. So I think we could say knowledge of the algorithms is one thing, and math facts, so like your ability to say, what 2 times 3 is another. Although generally speaking, the way I've read the literature is that procedural knowledge is considered both. And again, I think conceptual knowledge can be separated again too, because we can think of it, a concept is, for example, fraction can be equivalent. That's a concept. Application knowledge is your ability to apply that to a real mathematical problem. So in 2011, meta-analysis by Durkin, Brittle, Johnson, and Starr showed that teachers who included both conceptual and procedural knowledge in their classroom had a mean effect size of 0.54 compared to teachers who used one or the other. This would suggest to me pretty clearly that the evidence suggests that an iterative approach is more than a conceptualist view or a proceduralist, meaning that very simply, you need to teach both procedural and conceptual knowledge. You definitely see people arguing for one or the other. That's a dichotomy. And I don't know that you'd see too many actual math professors arguing, well, we only need to teach concepts or we only need to teach procedures. Although I'm sure Scott Decker in the audience could speak to that better than I could if anybody's actually arguing only teach for concepts or teach for procedures. Um, so there's a lot of myths, I think, about conceptual versus procedural knowledge and almost a level of magical thinking. I think one of the things I see put out there is only conceptual knowledge matters. The idea being that if students understand the concepts, then they should be able to apply their knowledge of math to create their own formulas and their own procedures. You also see this idea that the ability to apply math knowledge is what matters most. So it should be taught first. And that lastly, conceptual knowledge has to be taught via inquiry-based learning. I think this idea that um, application needs to be taught first is a little bit like the balanced literacy thing back again, where we thought that reading comprehension was what mattered. So the idea is let's teach reading comprehension as the focus and ignore the basic skills that underlie it. Well, it's very hard to understand a text that you can't read. Similarly, it's really hard to apply your math knowledge if you don't know any formulas. You can't imagine being given an advanced stats problem if I had never learned anything about stats in terms of the formulas to be used. You need both a procedural knowledge and a conceptual knowledge to apply your skills to new math problems. And this idea that conceptual knowledge has to be taught via inquiry-based learning, I've always thought that was kind of funny. People often see this argument of direct instruction versus inquiry-based learning as an argument between conceptual versus procedural knowledge. There's 100% zero reasons why you can't teach a math concept via direct instruction. For example, I've got this square on the screen. I have a square because it shows two triangles. The reason we teach or use the formula, the area of triangle is base times height divided by 2 is because that's half a square. That explanation is really simple. We've got a diagram, and it's been taught to you via direct instruction, although I'm sure you already knew it. Whereas in a constructivist inquiry-based learning model, I might say, here's a piece of paper, fold it in half. What do you notice? And pray that your students notice there's two triangles inside that square. I actually think it's easier and simpler to just explain that. That doesn't mean you can't use any inquiry-based learning to help reinforce concepts or to teach students through a teachable moment. It just means that we don't need to say that conceptual knowledge has to be taught through inquiry-based learning. Same as figure 1, figure 2, figure 3. I could say, what do we notice about these figures and have a 20-minute discussion about that. Or I could say that this represents a linear pattern that can be displayed in a t-table as each figure is going up by a certain number of amount. I see I have questions or chats. I'm just going to see. Oh, that's interesting. So Scott Decker said, I teach my pre-service teachers to provide procedural knowledge first and then practice that knowledge with applied practice activities. I think that model makes perfect sense. I've noticed that there's debate on what we should teach first, conceptual or procedural. I was talking to Dr. Corey Peltier about this, and he suggested that it might depend on which strand of math, but in certain strands of math, it might make sense more to teach conceptual first versus procedural, and procedural first, then conceptual. Personally, I've been teaching conceptual first and then explaining how procedures can be used or formulas can be used to apply those concepts. But I don't know that there's any significant research suggesting that one has to be taught before the other, just that you have to teach both. So inquiry-based learning, I think this is the big topic of the day. So John Hattie defines inquiry as an education practice in which students are called upon to behave as scientists or philosophers, generating questions and seeking to develop answers to the accumulation of evidence. This could include asking questions and solving problems, and often includes procedures such as small-scale investigations and practical projects. He identifies 8 meta-analyses on the topic with a mean effect size of 0.46. However, none of these meta-analyses were specifically on math or language. There was a meta-analysis of inquiry-based learning that was specific to science and math, and it showed a mean effect size of 0.66. However, it did show 2 findings, I think, that are very contrary to popular belief. So the first was that the more guidance was provided in that inquiry-based model, the better students did. In other words, the more direct instruction students were provided in an inquiry-based learning classroom, the better those students did. And the second, the younger students were the worst they did within that inquiry-based model. I think this is the fact, based on the fact that there's a certain level of base knowledge students need before they can start to discover things on their own. If you give a grade 12 student with a large background in math, an inquiry-based problem, they're going to do far better than if you give your kindergarten class, because the scaffolding is in place, the prior knowledge is in place. The more background knowledge we have on a topic, the easier it is for us to sort of begin self-exploring that topic on our own. And I do want to say this sort of flips the model on popular PD. I often see the claim that the younger students are, the more inquiry-based learning they need. I think the idea, I mean, is that it's more engaging for younger students. However, I think when we think back to language instruction, for example, I think most people here would probably accept that phonics is needed to teach students how to read. It's a lot harder to teach phonics through an implicit model of here are the words, guess what the letters mean, than it is to just explain to them what is that correlation between sound and letter. The next one I'm going to talk about is problem-based learning. So John Hattie defines problem-based learning as in problem-based learning scenarios, students often act in groups and decide what they need to learn to resolve a particular problem or question, while teachers act as facilitators. It usually involves real-world problems to promote student learning of concept and principles as opposed to direct presentations of facts and concepts. The aim is also to promote critical thinking skills, problem-solving skills, and communication skills. He identifies 23 different meta-analyses on this topic with a mean effect size of 0.35. However, the vast majority of these studies were looking at adult learners studying medicine. So again, it's really not a great idea to try and apply studies that are on college or university students studying medicine and try to apply it to your kindergarten classroom or your grade 1, 2 classroom. And this is just a principle of research, that when we look at research, we have to make sure the study matches the sample that we are going to apply it to. There was a 2014 meta-analysis specifically on math instruction, and it showed a mean negative effect size. Specifically on students' math conceptual knowledge, there's a negative effect size of 0.91. This means the only meta-analysis of specifically problem-based learning in math showed a negative effect size, meaning students taught with problem-based learning do worse than students not taught with problem-based learning. To the best of my knowledge on discovery-based learning, there exists only one peer-reviewed meta-analysis of this topic by Louis Alfieri in 2011. Their meta-analysis included 164 studies on students in grade 8 to 12. Study used strict inclusion criteria, however, did not specifically control for any subject, and they found a mean negative effect size of negative 0.38 for discovery-based learning, and a mean effect size of 0.30 for combining discovery-based learning with direct instruction, meaning that there's a difference of 0.60 or essentially 60% between discovery-based learning and discovery-based learning that included direct instruction. So again, discovery-based learning, like problem-based learning, is actually lowering learning outcomes. So to summarize, meta-analyses on problem-based learning and discovery-based learning for math instruction showed negative learning outcomes. Focusing on these types of approaches is likely to lower the math achievement in your classroom. So let's look at indirect instruction, which is sort of the alternative model. According to John Hattie's database, there have been 8 meta-analyses of direct instruction, including over 520,000 students, with a mean effect size of 0.56. The largest of these studies was done by Stockert et al. In 2018, and examined 328 studies, and it showed a large effect size for math. While the inclusion criteria was on the weaker side, there have been no meta-analyses on direct instruction, to the best of my knowledge, that have shown negligible or negative effects, unlike problem-based learning or discovery-based learning. Another thing I want to draw your attention to, as we look at these 4 different models, we see that the more direct instruction there is, the generally speaking, the higher the effect size. So direct instruction had the highest average effect size, then inquiry-based learning, then problem-based learning, and then discovery-based learning. These models can be seen in a sort of a linear position of the level of instruction and scaffolding being provided to students. In other words, the more instruction you provide your students, the more scaffolding you provide them, the more explicit support you provide them, the better they are likely to do on math assessments. I see a question in the chat. Okay, it's a comment, I believe. So what about learning disabled students? I think a big focus of the science of reading movement has been focused on the idea that dyslexic students are better supported by direct instruction in reading. The same thing can be applied to math. There was a meta-analysis by Gertz and et al. In 2009, and they looked at 25 single case study designs. Shout out to Scott Decker in the audience, who is a single case researcher in math. And it showed that direct instruction was the second most powerful tool for helping students with learning disabilities in math. Which again makes sense. The lower our students are, the more support they need. So I want to talk about word problems for a minute, because within this constructivist math model and approach, I think we often see a focus on these large situational problems of, let's give students an open-ended math problem, often one that requires multiple steps to solve it. There was a meta-analysis by Myers et al. In 2022, and they showed that single-step word problems showed double the benefit for students on achievement tests as did multi-step instruction. So when we give students a lot of multi-step math problems, that we actually, if we compare that to giving them a lot of single-step math problems, we're actually cutting our achievement in half. That doesn't mean that you should never teach a multi-step problem. It just means that the majority of our math problems in class, especially for lower elementary students, should be one procedural step and shouldn't require the students to do five. You know, I'll give you an example. As a teacher, when I was teaching grade 2, I had my students were given an exam where we had problems that required them to do both multiplication, division, addition, subtraction, and BEDMAS all at the same time. That type of problem is probably going to be inappropriate for a grade 2 student. Oh, I see the chat box has got a lot of questions in here.
We've got a question, Nate, whether you can address this now or later, because we can do some questions at the end as well. But Mel has a question about whether there's any research that you've come across about student age and direct instruction. So do early year students need more time for play and a pedagogy of play before moving into direct instruction as they are older?
Yeah, there isn't a ton of research on it. However, there is a little. Like I said earlier, the meta-analysis that looked at age and inquiry-based learning showed that the older students were, the more they benefited from an inquiry-based approach, and the younger they were, the less they benefited. There was a large movement in the 90s on something called developmentally appropriate pedagogy, which was a movement largely led by teachers to reduce expectations in lower grades and to increase play-based learning. In my book, I looked at the research on this topic, and I was only able to find one rigorous study of this type of approach, and it showed that the students who had the more play-based learning in the early grades actually did worse than the students who did not, at least in terms of academic outcomes. They rated their happiness as higher, but they did worse on assessments. And I think something that we need to remember as we look at this debate of direct instruction versus inquiry-based learning, it's not all or nothing. The value of including discovery-based learning in your classroom is probably primarily one of engagement and enjoyment. Your students are going to enjoy having some inquiry-based learning, but you can go too far with that. Just like if you have all scripted lessons and all textbook work in your class and your kids are just sitting there listening to you lecture every class and then doing their 100 math problems from their textbook, there's probably not going to be a lot of child happiness in that classroom, for lack of a better word. But I also think student happiness also comes from knowing the material well. I know in my experience, I've typically had one class a day where I focus on more of an inquiry-based math model, and one class where I typically focus more on a direct instruction model. And my students typically prefer the direct instruction class better. And I do still provide them with some inquiry-based learning because I want them to develop their problem-solving skills. That's my purpose, their ability to take the knowledge that I've taught them in the direct instruction and apply it to other problems, which students often are quite resistant to. So I don't know if it's purely one is makes students happy and one does not. I think that we are always going to have to try and strike a balance. And it's funny, we have this, I was joking about balanced math at the beginning of this conversation, and there's this debate on balanced literacy. I think the idea of balancing instructional models is actually a good idea. I think where the problem with Slide is where we found that balance, historically speaking, is deeply problematic. And I see there's 6 new questions since I've.
There's quite a few. A lot of them are about particular people or particular programs. We might hold some of those to the end. And also, I know that Nate's sort of not keen to talk about particular people or particular programs. Maybe, considering firstly he's in Canada and also, being conscious of how that might go. But we might have a general chat about particular programs at the end, or
Sure.
some more like that at the end.
Yeah,
So
I will say my knowledge of particular people's math programs is lower than it is of particular reading programs. But I will also say, just in general, I think we often want to construct heroes and villains of these debates. This author is the good author and this author is the bad author. And I don't know that that's helpful. And I think sometimes it even results in bullying online and social media of certain authors who are disrespected by certain groups. So I've always been keen to sort of avoid that. I think, as teachers, we want to treat other people the way we want our students to treat other people. So you won't, for the best part, I'm going to try my very best to not criticize any specific person, and just focus on the ideas that I think are positive versus harmful. But I will come back to the chat in a few minutes. I think I'm going to be finished a bit early.
yeah.
So we have student control over learning. I think a lot of this constructivist model is hoping to increase student control over learning. And in general, we don't see a positive benefit for this, or we see a negligible benefit for this. And you'll notice I have like a little picture of a math game on the slide. I don't know this math game. I just Googled image math games and pick one. And I just point this out because I think the most engaging lesson is going to be the most fun lesson, but it's not necessarily going to be the most educational. If you tell students, you get to choose what we do today, you might be told, well, we're going to watch movies, we're going to eat snacks, we're going to play some sports and play some video games. But I don't know how much learning is going to happen as a result of that. And that's not to say that student choice and student control over learning is a bad thing or that we should always limit it. But it's recognizing that that's not going to be a lever that we pull that's going to make a big impact on our classrooms. That's a lever we pull to empower students' engagement, not necessarily to empower their learning. And in general, I think that's a factor we have to remember is that learning and engagement are not the same thing. But engagement helps learning, but you can definitely go too far with focusing on engagement. The focus should always be on learning. So one of the things that comes up a lot by certain authors is this claim that math anxiety, that if we teach students using a direct instruction model, that they're going to feel anxious about math and then it's going to lower achievement. Now, this isn't a topic I personally spent a lot of time researching, but it is one that Dr. Corey Pelletier has researched, and he's someone I've referenced in this presentation because he's an expert I really respect. So he wrote that according to the OECD's Program for International Student Achievement, PISA, study of 15-year-old students, a 1-point increase in the index of mathematics anxiety is associated with a decrease in mathematics achievement at 18 score points, close to the equivalence of 1 year's worth of learning. And that's after accounting for socioeconomic backgrounds. So in other words, having math anxiety does very significantly reduce learning outcomes in the classroom. However, it's where we get to the cause and effect that is problematic. So the cause and effect relationship between mathematics achievement and mathematics anxiety are not fully understood, but generally difficulties or perceived difficulties independent of achievement with mathematics precede the emergence of mathematics anxiety. In other words, students who experience early difficulties in math are more likely to suffer math anxiety rather than the other way around. And I think this makes sense when we think of, say, dyslexic students. I think a lot of people have heard that anecdote that dyslexic students want to avoid reading in the class, especially in front of their peers. If you feel like you're bad at math, you're going to feel anxious at math. And I know that generally speaking, as a kid, I felt super anxious about math. And I remember tuning teachers out. But that's I think part of why it's important to focus on providing that extra support to students who are struggling with math so that they don't feel anxious, rather than trying to make the math all fun and easy. Let's bring the students up. One way I like to think about it is that teaching is a lot about expectations. If you are teaching basketball and you have a student who's struggling to get to the net, rather than lower the net to help the student, I think it's better to raise the student up and give them support so they can actually reach that net. So let's summarize, what does the research actually show? Generally speaking, direct instruction is effective for teaching math. Inquiry-based learning is effective for teaching older, more proficient math students. Inquiry-based learning is more effective when it includes more explicit instruction. Problem-based learning and discovering-based learning may decrease math achievement. Both conceptual and procedural knowledge need to be taught. Too many open-ended multi-step math problems lead to lower mathematical achievement. Math anxiety is real and lower achievement, but it is caused by low mathematical knowledge, not the other way around. One question I saw in the pre-questions was, what about gifted students? And I'm really happy that this question came up because I think assessment is king. We got to meet our students where they're at. I've never been a fan of just teaching to the general class in math, particularly, unlike, say, reading, where I think it's a little easier, but not much. And that's just because you often see such a wide um, variety of ability levels in your class. So rather than giving your most gifted students the same instruction as everybody else, I think it actually makes sense to provide them with more inquiry-based learning, more open-end instruction, because I think if they have that general base knowledge, they're going to do more of that. As an elementary school teacher, I've taught elementary kids trigonometry, advanced algebra, coding, calculus, and I've given them a lot more inquiry-based learning and discovery-based learning and project-based learning when they're gifted. I had a student a couple years ago who wrote a paper on the theory of relativity in math class because he had mastered all of the basic principles taught in my classroom. But you can't do that if you're not basing it in assessment data. I think it's really important that you're assessing your students on a regular basis. And if your students do your assessment and they already demonstrate mastery, I think it's perfectly okay to move them on to something else. So whenever I start a unit of math, the first thing I do is an assessment. And then I do an assessment each week to see how they're progressing. And if my whole class isn't progressing, going back to that RTI model of instruction, I change how I'm teaching to try and provide more support. And I try and provide more explicit instruction based around my students' needs or my perception of their needs. And if, day one, I hand out the math assessment and I have a kid who gets 95% on it, I'm not going to spend the rest of the month teaching that kid that curriculum. I'm going to move them on to something else. And I think doing that model week to week to week, where you are frequently assessing your students, you can actually very much speed up the level of instruction for some of your students. And that's how you might get to some really advanced concepts like trigonometry or calculus with, say, a grade 7, 8 students, if you're providing them the opportunity to test out, for lack of a better word. So this is my tips on lesson planning. And I think it's important to remember that when we look at research, research isn't going to tell you exactly how to teach. Research is going to show you studies of, generally speaking, what we know, but it's not a model for the most part. There are evidence-based models like CRA. This is my best interpretation of the literature and how I personally teach my class. So generally speaking, within a lesson plan, I start with an explanation of the mathematical concepts. Then I provide the students with an explanation of the algorithms, and I explain how to apply those algorithms or formulas. Then I give them targeted practice as a group. So I might put a math problem on the chalkboard, ask them to try it together, and then we go through those steps together. Then I give them individual practice, and then we take up that work, assess, and I give feedback. And I think it's really important. Again, you're always assessing and you're always giving feedback. The more you can do that, the better students can do. But doesn't mean that you have to go through the old school model of handing out 100 math problems a night and then marking every single math problem and telling the students how to solve those, because you'll be buried in marking. But it does mean you need to give students frequent opportunity to show you where they're succeeding and where they're struggling. In a math problem, there's a lot of different places a student can struggle. Let's say, look at a fraction math problem for a second. If you give them a multiplication problem, they might struggle with the conceptual and they might try and find the common denominator first and then times the numbers. They might struggle with the procedural knowledge and times the wrong numbers with each other. Or they might struggle with the computational knowledge and their math facts might be wrong. So they might get the question wrong, even though they've done everything right. And being able to look at the student and understand where they made a mistake allows you to know where you need to increase the instruction. So when we're talking about unit planning, I would suggest Start heavy on the conceptual knowledge. As students gain expertise, provide more procedural work and less explicit instruction. Assess students at least once a week to guide your instruction. And when students are close to mastery, provide more open-ended practice. Generally speaking, I almost like to think of it as like an inversion, an inverted triangle. The beginning of the unit, providing more direct instruction. The end of the unit, we're providing less direct instruction. And I think the same sort of applies to students in general math. If I have a kindergarten student, I'm not going to be providing a lot of inquiry-based learning. If I have a grade 12 student, I might be providing a lot of inquiry-based learning. Generally speaking, the more advanced students are, the less explicit instruction they're going to require. So resources for further study include my book, if you're interested, The Scientific Principles of Teaching. Almost every slide on this presentation was based on my book. The Science of Math, which is a website run by a group of math professors in the United States. And you can always check out my blog, Pedagogy non grata. And if you want to, I'm going to be sharing this slideshow with people if they want to use it for their own PD purposes in their schools, not necessarily for commercial purposes. And includes the links to the articles that I based these references on. So there was too many references for me to include bibliography on the slideshow. However, there were several articles that I wrote that had bibliographies that this research was all based on. And I'm going to start opening up the chat box. I see there's 25 comments and questions. I'm going to try and do my best to work my way through those.
I'll throw a few to Nate. So while you're catching your breath, I'll share some of my takeaways. Thank you so much for putting that presentation together. And I think it's really great for people to see a lot of the research behind some of the approaches and why some of these approaches have come into trend and what's been behind some of that thinking. And I suppose what I've really taken away is the idea that we need to be addressing both procedural and conceptual knowledge. And it's not a you must only teach one thing or you must only teach another thing. And as you said, there's probably not very many people out there that are advocating for only one thing or the other anyway. That seems to be a little bit of the media beat up about, oh, people are saying you must do one thing or people are saying you must do the other, when it actually is both. That is what is going to support our students. And that when students are novices, and that novice could mean younger students or novice in that they're new to the concept that you're addressing, that's when they need more guidance and more explicit instruction. But as they gain mastery and get confidence around that concept, that's when you can begin to provide perhaps some more open-ended things, or if they're a gifted student, you can sort of fast track them towards those kind of tasks as well. So we've got a few questions here that I'll throw to you. So, and as I said, some of them are about particular people and particular programs, and we don't want to get too far into that today. I know that depending on your system, you might be encouraged to be using a certain program or work with a certain person. And, you know, we're not going to comment on what that is, but it's really interesting to have a good think about what model that they might be promoting. So one of the comments was about, here we go, let's come up here. And you've also had Scott. Is Scott your colleague? He's really launched into the chat with some really good comments for you as well, which has been good. A few people asked about the difference that you've used the terms direct instruction and explicit instruction. And sometimes you've said one between or switch between them. And that the commenter Rebecca says that she's had some pre-service or in-service teachers. So these are teachers that are still undergoing their training, sort of very strongly arguing that those are not interchangeable. We can't say direct instruction and explicit instruction are the same thing. And there's a bit of chat about that. Do you want to comment on the terms that you've used or what you've learned in that research?
Very, very hesitantly. I sort of laugh at that question because I think there's definitely some scholars over there who have taken ownership of that word. So if you look up the definition of direct instruction or explicit instruction, you'll see a lot of different answers online, and depending on the paper you read. I'm a little bit hesitant to apply any specific pedagogical model to the term direct instruction or explicit instruction. And you do see that people will be like, well, step one of a direct instruction lesson is X, step two is X, step three is X, step four is X. And you'll see people say the same thing about explicit. I don't want to get too into the weeds on that. I would just say that to me, direct instruction or explicit instruction with one key caveat means that you're directly explaining concepts, that you're scaffolding it, that you're providing supports to students. But it's an explicit process. It's not a discovery or inquiry process. I know that there's definitely scholars out there who would say I'm wrong. But I'm not trying to look at this from like an academic perspective of like, well, what does X researcher define direct instruction as? I'm trying to think of it more in a practical sense. How are we applying this in a classroom? But the one exception I would be that capital DI or capital direct instruction is often used to refer to a specific set of group of programs that are scripted. So when I'm saying direct instruction here, I'm not necessarily referring to a scripted model of direct instruction, although there are scripted programs you can buy out there that help you to teach students. Generally speaking, the research seems to be quite positive about scripted programs that are explicit. They're not my preference though, personally as a teacher. I think inherently I have a little bit of an anarchist streak to me, for lack of a better word. So I don't love following a script. I'd much rather create my own approach in the classroom. But there's definitely research to support using a scripted model if that's what you want to use in your classroom.
Great. And a few people are sort of chiming in here. Catherine saying direct instruction, as raised in our media a lot in Australia, is generally referring to scripted programs. And you're right that people do use these terms differently, but
Yeah.
generally say that that's a scripted program, although people will sort of deal with that differently. Another question from Emily. Emily wanted to ask about number talks. And whether something like a number talk at the start of a class and that it's usually unrelated to the content that you might be teaching. Do you think that that might be more of a constructivist approach, or do you have a comment at all about number talks in your research?
Yeah, I wrote about number talks in my actually I'm working on another book actually where I've written about number talks. Excuse myself for a second. There's definitely a little bit of research on number talks. It's not much. The research we do have is not particularly compelling. And it's definitely been used primarily as a constructivist strategy. So the authors who promote number talks are generally speaking constructivist. Um, there is a branded version of a number talk where you have like hand signals to signify certain things. You talk a certain way, and there's even scripts you could follow to do your number talks. Generally speaking, I think it's a way of teaching conceptual knowledge through an inquiry approach, through discussion, but it's a more scaffolded a version of that. I don't think it's a terrible idea. I've had seen people in PD say this is the most evidence-based strategy. It's not. There's not a ton of research on it. Um, and I think it does depend on how you apply it. I think the more explicit you are with your number talk, the more feedback and support you're giving, the better. And I think you kind of hinted at this, Sasha. If it's not connected to your topic of the day, I think generally speaking, that's probably a bad idea. Going back to what we know about reading instruction, a systematic approach tends to do better than an unsystematic approach. Um, but there are some good ideas. We know that research, generally speaking, shows that talking about math supports students, that we want to have rich math conversations in our classrooms. And we also know that teaching multiple heuristics, meaning teaching multiple ways of solving a problem, is generally speaking a good thing. So, and I think that's what Number Talks is really after, is trying to teach students that when you have a math problem, there's probably multiple ways you can tackle and solve that problem. A couple of years ago, I interviewed Dr. John Starr, and he's a big fan of um, using multiple heuristics or multiple formulas to solve a math problem. And he pointed out to me that you should probably not cover more than two formulas though in a class. So it's a great idea to, if you're teaching math lesson, to be like, hey, here's two ways you can solve this math problem. It's not, generally speaking, a great idea to be like, here's three or four, and sort of getting to that idea of cognitive overload. If we're giving students, five different ways to solve a problem, they might get confused between those two different methods. But students might have a method that they find easier. And I'll give a really specific example, and that's I find a lot of kids struggle with fractions. And we typically teach fractions, especially adding and subtracting fractions, through the lowest common denominator algorithm. However, um, as an adult, I rarely use common denominators. I typically convert everything to decimals with my calculator and I just use it that way. So when I have students who are really struggling with fractions, that's something I'll do is I'll teach them how to just convert it all to decimals, how to redo the question with a decimal format rather than a fraction format. And I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that either.
Thank you. We might just do one more. I'm thinking of the time. And so Helen's got a question about long-term memory, which we didn't touch on tonight, so don't know if this is left field for you, but how do you deal with embedding learning into long-term memory when you might only deal with a topic once or twice a year? And there's probably a few other people in the chat that I think could comment on how they might structure their learning for this as well, and how we think about long-term memory. But any thoughts on that, Nate?
Yeah, I haven't seen a ton of like strong research on this topic. I think I have seen the argument that inquiry-based learning is better for long-term memory than short-term, or sorry, than is direct instruction. However, I've not seen any research to support that argument. I think it's just a claim that's popularly made. Um, a better approach, I think, is sort of using a spiral approach to math. And I think this is something that's more commonly talked about in reading. If anyone's familiar with the UFLI program, this is something they do with their scope and sequence. But generally speaking, we want to spiral our math curriculum. We want to have elements that we teach at the beginning of the year come back throughout the year. So every time you teach a new piece of math, I think it's a great idea to layer that into your math work. And a really easy way to do this, I think, is that, I talk about how at the beginning of a unit, you might want to have more simple math questions and you might want to have more of a direct instruction approach. And as students become more proficient throughout the unit, you might want to use more open-ended math problems. So then when you're doing those more open-ended math problems, bringing in the math from previous units and having some multi-step problems that include math from previous units, I think is a great way to layer that so that we're constantly building that long-term memory. And I think that the key to long-term memory is actually just doing something over and over again. It's about that automaticity.
And Helen, you might find it helpful to have a look at Maths Review if people have commented that in the chat, and bringing, daily review into your lessons, and also looking at like an interleaved scope and sequence like Shaping Minds or from OCA, where you might look at a subject more than once or twice a year. You come back to that topic several times over the year. Now, Nathaniel, you have so many different ways that people can find out more about your work, including your Twitter handle, which is not Nathaniel Hansford. So can you share how people can reach out to you to ask questions? Is Twitter the best place, or where they can find out a little bit more about some of the work you've done around this research?
Yeah, I mean, Twitter is definitely a great place. It's Nate Joseph on Twitter. Um, I generally speaking respond to everybody. You can always go check out my Facebook page, which is Pedagogy Non Grata, named after the blog. Or on my website, there is an email listed for contact, which sometimes people contact me with questions through there, and that's evidence.based.teaching@gmail.com. Yeah.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you.
I do want to thank everyone for coming to join my presentation today, though. It's been an absolute pleasure to get to talk about a favorite topic of mine and nerd out for an hour at 5 o'clock in the morning here.
That's right. It's very early for you. No, we really appreciate it. And another good place for people who are interested, or this might be some people who are new to the idea of explicit teaching in maths, especially with some of the changes happening here in Australia. We do have another webinar tomorrow night with Think Forward, where I think Ollie Lovell and Tony Hatton-Roberts and David McCarness are going to discuss explicit maths instruction as well, and some exciting developments there. So that might be something that you'd like to sign up to if you'd like some further information as well. So thank you so much. I'm sure you join me in thanking Nate for all of his research and knowledge. We really appreciate it. And I hope everyone else has a great night. Thank you.